perspective of mimetic theory, but also, and that's very important for us, he has experience in the field from a conflict resolution perspective. So that's the bundle. I am not an expert, but I would try to find out what we can, what is our answer to those questions about the relationship between mimetic theory and the case of Israel and Palestine. And the second question, should we go forward, in what way, whatever. We start in the order I told you, so Wilhelm Guckenberger will tell us about Raimund Schwager's initial proposal, please.
So it's really so that the fact that I'm part of this panel is like a little bit like we would express it in German, like a virgin having a baby. Because being sometimes in the region doesn't make an expert out of me. But I'm really engaged observer of the situation. Causes may be that Israel and Palestine also for Christian people is the Holy Land, and another cause may be that the situation there seems to mirror somehow my own human condition. And yeah. So my task is to recapitulate a little bit what Raimund Schwager's intention was. He wrote two main articles about this issue. I have the books here, you can find them. That's the book of the Innsbruck Conference 2003, Passions in Economy, Politics and the Media. And there you have an English written article of Raimund Schwager. And there's also a German article on this issue of the problem of the conflict in Israel and Palestine. 60 years after the foundation of the State of Israel, the situation in the region is very complex and tricky, although the positions of the people living there are not difficult to understand, I think. It's easy to understand the longing of the Palestinian people for an independent state. It's easy to understand the wish of the Jewish people to live safe from hostile attacks in that state. They have made a fantastic country during the last decades, I think. Even taking part of each side is very easy, especially for the very reason that both of them are victims of a somber history full of suffered violence, deceit and betrayal. That's the starting point of Schwager's considerations. All the involved peoples are victims, and also a lot of the involved people are personally victims, in fact. And for this, the conflict gets a lot of response all over the world. Schwager writes, quote, "The modern world is stamped with sensitivity to victims. Whoever can show that he or she has become the victim of foreign dictates and violence gains attention and receptiveness. One speaks, therefore, of an international victim culture," unquote. That, I think, is the first and maybe most important reason to apply the mimetic approach to this conflict with the idea of better understanding and maybe finding hints of a solution, because we've learned a lot about the importance of the structures of the victim discourse by René Girard. To say this also means to recognize the religious dimension of the conflict. This dimension is used to be mentioned by almost each of the numerous commentators, but of course, frequently it's mentioned in a very superficial way. Religious dimension of the conflict doesn't mean a clash of different monotheistic groups with their conflicting universal truths. It means the conflict between groups who are all heirs of a revelation that shows God's siding with victims. Each of them tries to take this revelation seriously. Each of them, or each of us, Jews, Christians and Muslims, are doing this in an insufficient and partly wrong way on and on, but the fundamental belief they have in common. That means the very core of the religious dimension of the conflict is not merely the conflict between one religion and another, but the conflict between the right, and that means the authentic, and a distorted understanding of the one revelation we may call the Abrahamic one. So, what the reality of the victim discourse in Israel and Palestine is, we all know about. I have a long list here we could mention, but I do skip that because you know it and because we all have heard these facts during the last 5 years, on and on, in the Israel-Palestine sessions in our conferences. And it seems important to me to recognize that these are really facts we've heard about, facts which must not be forgotten. But by the repeated naming of these facts, the conflict parties get trapped in mutual accusation, get trapped in a mimetic cycle. You tell me and the whole world what you've suffered from, I will tell you and the whole world what I've suffered from more than you. And therefore, Schwager says, memory is a double-edged sword. So we're really faced with a dilemma. On the one side of the dilemma can be described by one of the main ideas of the new political theology of Johann Baptist Metz. Metz urges us not to forget the victims of the history. He asserts the remembrance of them to be the essential duty of theology and the essential duty of Christian individuals and communities. And without this, it becomes irresponsible to refer to God after Auschwitz. However, that's a theological argument. I think we also have a widespread secular parallel argumentation in the Western world. So that we may paraphrase, it's irresponsible to refer to ethics after Auschwitz if we do not remember the victims of history. But on the other hand, collective trauma tend to become chosen trauma, as the psychoanalyst Vamik Volkam calls it, are becoming more and more important in the discourse. Chosen trauma turn into part of the identity of a group or a people by continuous repetition of what has happened and what has insulted the group or the ancestors of the group. That is why it becomes more and more difficult to overcome them. Raimund Schwager, for example, quotes Elie Wiesel in this context, who says that each member of the Jewish people has to be involved in the Holocaust regardless when he or she has been born, as if he or she would have been persecuted, tortured, and killed personally. But also Palestinians have their chosen trauma. Let me mention the key as a symbol of refugees. Palestinian grandparents hand the rusty keys of their houses they have left in 1948 over to their grandchildren, and the children have to promise them never to forget that these houses, which are not existing anymore for the most part, and which they have never seen, are their real homes. So how should they ever find a new home in Jordan or in West Bank territory and so on? They live in villages there, which are not so much different from other usual Arab villages in the area, but these villages are called refugee camps, hitherto. It's not easy to be pleased and happy living in a refugee camp. So is it possible to find a solution to this dilemma? Necessity of remembrance on the one hand and the burden of remembrance on the other. Is there any way out of the dead end the people there are in now? Raimund Schwager says that a solution could become possible only if both sides will recognize and admit to be victims and perpetrators at the same time. So the one-eyed perspective could be left behind, and remembrance could become redeeming by becoming a common remembrance of all involved parties. But of course, that's a very demanding proposal. Schwager himself points out that such an insight presupposes a real